The sterile hallway of the precinct stretched endlessly before her, its white walls gleaming under the harsh glare of flickering fluorescent lights. A sharp, trembling cry pierced the air, "Get your hands off me!" But the sound barely had time to echo before it was smothered by the iron grip of a uniformed officer. His fingers clamped tighter around her arm, unyielding, as though her words were nothing more than a fleeting annoyance to be crushed. The lights above buzzed faintly, casting jagged shadows that danced across the scene, almost as if they were reluctant witnesses to an injustice unfolding in plain sight, a moment that shouldn't have been happening. Couldn't have been happening, yet was. Her face pressed hard against the cold, unfeeling wall, the woman's breath came in shallow gasps. Her wrists, pinned behind her back, throbbed under the bite of metal cuffs that seemed to tighten with every passing second. She pleaded, her voice raw with a desperate need for reason to prevail. "Please, just listen to me," she said. The words trembling but resolute. But reason had no foothold here, not in this sterile corridor, not in this fleeting, chaotic moment where power reigned unchecked. The officer towering over her barely registered her plea. His eyes, cold and unblinking, glinted with something darker than mere authority, a disdain that cut deeper than the cuffs ever could. "You think you can just waltz in here like you own the damn place?" he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Each syllable was a blade, sharp and deliberate, honed by years of resentment he didn't bother to hide. "I've seen your kind before, scheming, lying, pretending you're something you're not." His grip tightened as he spoke, jerking her arm with a force that made her stumble. She winced as the cuffs dug into her flesh, cutting off the blood flow until her hands tingled with numbness. Pain shot through her. But she clenched her jaw, refusing to let it break her. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat echoing in her ears, yet she forced her voice to steady. "This is a mistake," she said. Each word deliberate. "I work here." "Shut up," he barked, cutting her off mid-sentence. His words weren't just a command, they were a dismissal, a declaration that she didn't belong. That her very existence in this space was an affront to him. He spat the phrase with such contempt that it felt like a physical blow, stripping her of dignity in a single breath. She wasn't human to him, not in that moment. She was an intruder, an anomaly, something less than. Her eyes darted around the hallway, searching for a savior. A flicker of compassion in the faces of those nearby. But all she found were averted gazes, shoulders turned away. And a deafening silence that roared louder than the officer's venomous shouts ever could. "Please, let me explain," she tried again, her voice cracking as desperation clawed its way to the surface. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the humiliation burning hotter with every passing second. "Explain what?" he snapped, dragging her forward by the arm. His nails dug into her skin, leaving angry red marks that would linger long after this moment passed. "How you slipped past security. How you thought you could fool everyone." His tone grew darker, more menacing. "You people always think you're above the rules." The phrase, "you people," landed like a sledgehammer, heavier than his grip, heavier than the cuffs that now bruised her bones. Her breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, painful intake of air. She knew exactly what he saw when he looked at her, dark skin, natural curls framing her face. Features that didn't align with his narrow vision of who belonged in a place like this. It didn't matter that she carried herself with confidence, that her clothes were pressed and professional, or that her wallet held credentials proving her right to be here. To him, none of that mattered. To him, she was an outsider who didn't deserve the space she occupied. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever as he pulled her along, each step amplifying the ache in her wrists and the fire in her chest. From the nearby desks, murmurs floated toward her like ghostly whispers, judgments masked as curiosity, pity that did nothing to ease her suffering. She caught snippets of conversations. Hushed tones from officers and clerks who watched from the sidelines. One young clerk, barely out of training, fidgeted with a stack of papers, his eyes darting toward her before snapping back to his work. Another officer, older and grizzled, leaned against a filing cabinet, his lips pursed in disapproval, not at the scene unfolding, but at her, as if she'd brought this upon herself. The pity in their stares stung worse than the disdain. It was a hollow gesture, a refusal to act cloaked as sympathy. "You need to listen to me," she said, her voice rising with a newfound force as she planted her feet against the tiled floor. The officer spun around, his eyes blazing with fury. "Listen to you?" he scoffed, his hand slamming against her shoulder. The impact shoved her back against the wall, the rough concrete scraping against her spine. "You don't give orders here." She gritted her teeth, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not now. Not in front of him. The lump in her throat grew, but she swallowed it down, her resolve hardening like steel. Her voice dropped to a low, steady growl. "If you don't let me go, you're going to regret this." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the hallway. It wasn't the laugh of a man unsure of himself, nor one wrestling with doubt. It was cruel, dripping with condescension, a sound that mocked her defiance. "Is that a threat?" he taunted, looming over her. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze head-on. "No," she said, her voice calm and unshaken. "It's a fact." But he didn't hear her, or didn't want to. He was already moving, dragging her forward again as if she were nothing more than a petty criminal, a trespasser unworthy of even a shred of doubt. The truth she longed to scream, the reality of who she was, remained locked inside her, a silent storm raging beneath her composed exterior. He shoved open the door to the interrogation room with a grunt, the heavy metal swinging wide to reveal a stark, gray space that smelled faintly of sweat and despair. Forcing her down into a chair, he stood over her, his presence a towering shadow of arrogance. "We'll see how tough you are when you're rotting in a cell," he sneered, his lips curling into a smug grin. She stared back at him, her chest heaving with every breath, her wrists screaming in protest against the cuffs. "You don't even know who I am," she said, her voice quiet but laced with an unshakable certainty. "And I don't care," he shot back, turning toward the door as if the conversation were beneath him. That was the moment everything changed, not for him, not yet, but for her. She stopped struggling, stopped pleading. Instead, she let the silence settle around her like a shield. She watched him, his smugness radiating off him in waves, and she waited. She waited for the inevitable. For the moment when the world he thought he controlled would unravel beneath his feet. Because she wasn't just another woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She wasn't someone he could dismiss and forget. She was someone who had fought tooth and nail to earn her place in this building. Someone with power he couldn't begin to comprehend, and someone who wouldn't let this injustice slide. Outside the room, the faint sound of footsteps grew louder, accompanied by rising voices that carried an urgency he couldn't yet fathom. A name was spoken, a name that made the officer's shoulders stiffen, though he didn't turn around. The air shifted, thick with anticipation, and when the door finally swung open, the truth stepped inside like a tidal wave. Her heart didn't race in that moment, his did. His smug grin faltered, his eyes widening as recognition dawned. The woman he'd humiliated, the one he'd dismissed as powerless, was someone who held his fate in her hands. What happens when a man who believes he wields absolute power realizes he's misjudged everything? What happens when the person he sought to crush rises to determine his downfall? This wasn't just a fleeting altercation, it was a reckoning, a collision of arrogance and consequence that no one could have predicted. The officer who'd started this storm would soon face the fallout of his actions, a punishment that would leave him, and everyone watching, reeling in disbelief. But beneath the surface of this confrontation lay a deeper lesson: justice, when it arrives, isn't always neat or satisfying. Sometimes it reveals cracks in the world far more dangerous than anyone expects. The precinct buzzed with its usual chaos, phones ringing, papers rustling, footsteps clattering down the halls, but beneath it all lingered a tension that prickled the skin. Detective Olivia Hayes felt it the moment she walked through those doors each day. A weight she'd grown accustomed to carrying. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the polished floor, nodding curtly to the few colleagues who met her gaze. Most offered polite smiles, though some turned away quickly, their eyes skittering to the ground. Olivia had long since stopped letting it wound her. It wasn't personal, not entirely. It was what she represented. A break in the old guard, a challenge to the unspoken rules that had governed this place for decades. Her office was a sanctuary of sorts, its walls adorned with framed certificates and awards that whispered of her triumphs. Photos of her family lined the shelves, her father's fireman's helmet resting in one corner, a testament to his courage, her mother's books on education stacked neatly in a cabinet, symbols of the wisdom that had shaped her. Yet even here, surrounded by these quiet victories, the air felt heavy. Every move she made was watched, every decision dissected. She couldn't afford to falter, not when the stakes were this high. Across the station, Officer Ethan Wallace lounged in his chair, his broad frame dominating the space. With his sharp jaw and steely gaze, he looked every inch the enforcer, a man who thrived on control. He scanned the bullpen with the lazy confidence of a predator, his arms crossed as he sized up the room. To him, this precinct was his domain. And anyone who didn't fit his rigid mold was a threat to be neutralized. When his eyes landed on Olivia that day, something in him snapped, a spark of resentment igniting into a blaze he couldn't contain. And in that moment, he set in motion a chain of events that would teach him a lesson he'd never forget: power, when abused, has a way of turning on its wielder with a vengeance that spares no one. The air in the precinct that morning hung thick with an unspoken tension. A heaviness that Olivia could feel pressing against her chest as she walked through the dimly lit corridors. She had always been attuned to the undercurrents swirling beneath the surface of this place, vibes that whispered of secrets, power plays, and buried truths. But today, something sharper clawed at her instincts, something embodied in the man striding ahead of her down the hall: Ethan. He moved with the swagger of someone who'd dodged accountability one too many times, his broad shoulders squared, his steps deliberate, as if the world bent to his will simply because he demanded it. Olivia had known men like him before, men who mistook trembling hands and averted eyes for loyalty, who swung their authority like a blunt instrument, heedless of the wreckage left behind. She'd seen it in the way people scurried out of his path, their heads ducked low, their silence louder than any protest. And she'd heard the rumors too. Hushed tales traded over lukewarm coffee in break rooms, stories of Ethan's temper flaring like wildfire, of boundaries trampled underfoot, of complaints scribbled in desperation only to vanish into the labyrinth of bureaucracy, swallowed by some unseen hand. Their history had never been smooth. From the moment Olivia stepped into her role, Ethan had bristled at her presence, his pride wounded by the idea of answering to anyone, especially her. She could still picture the sneer curling his lip during their first meeting, the way his eyes had sized her up, searching for weakness. Olivia, though, was no stranger to navigating hostility. She'd learned early on to choose her fights with precision, to sidestep his provocations rather than meet them head-on. Confronting Ethan outright would only stoke the embers of his resentment. And she had no interest in feeding his ego with a showdown. Instead, she poured her energy into her work, forging connections with the team, earning their trust through quiet competence. All while keeping Ethan at a wary distance. But no amount of careful maneuvering could erase the friction that crackled between them, a live wire waiting for a spark. That morning, Olivia had arrived before the sun breached the horizon, her breath fogging in the crisp March air as she unlocked the station's heavy doors. It was her ritual, settling into the stillness. Organizing her thoughts before the chaos of the day descended. She'd just set her coffee down, steam curling lazily from the mug, when the alert buzzed through her radio. An unauthorized individual in the restricted area. Her stomach tightened, a flicker of unease rippling through her. Before she could even process the message, Ethan was on the move. His voice booming down the corridor as he barked orders at anyone within earshot. Olivia's pulse quickened as she grabbed her jacket and followed, her boots clicking against the worn linoleum. The restricted area wasn't just any part of the station, it was a fortress within a fortress, its thick walls and frosted windows guarding secrets that weren't meant to see daylight. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she hurried after him, the shadows stretching long and jagged across the floor. When she stepped into the room, the scene hit her like a punch to the gut. The space was claustrophobic, its air stale and heavy, the walls looming with their reinforced doors and opaque glass. It was a place designed for containment, for order, yet chaos pulsed within it now. Ethan stood at the center, his imposing frame casting a shadow over a woman pinned against the wall. Her hands were bound behind her back, the cuffs glinting dully under the harsh light. Olivia's eyes darted to the woman's wrists, where the metal had already etched angry red lines into her skin. A silent testament to the force Ethan had used. The woman's shoulders were rigid, her spine straight despite the strain, and though her face was pale, her eyes blazed with a defiance that refused to crack. She wasn't sobbing or pleading, none of the desperation Olivia might have expected, but the effort it took to hold herself together was etched into every tense muscle, every shallow breath. Ethan's voice sliced through the room, sharp and venomous, filling the space like a storm cloud. "You don't belong here. Who let you in?" His words dripped with contempt. Each syllable a jab meant to wound. The woman tilted her chin upward, a small but deliberate act of resistance, and when she spoke, her voice held steady despite the tremor Olivia could sense lurking beneath it. "I work here." Ethan's laugh erupted, short and brutal, bouncing off the walls like a gunshot. "You work here? Doing what, scrubbing the floors?" The woman flinched, a barely perceptible twitch, but she didn't crumble. "Look in my bag," she said, her tone firm. "My ID's in there." Olivia's heart hammered against her ribs as she edged closer, her gaze flickering between Ethan and the woman. She could see the strain in the woman's posture, the way her shoulders pulled back against the cuffs, the way her jaw clenched as if biting back a flood of emotion. But what struck Olivia hardest was the silence blanketing the room. The handful of officers lingering near the door, their faces half hidden in shadow, refused to meet her eyes. Their stillness screamed complicity, a collective refusal to acknowledge the ugliness unfolding before them. It gnawed at her, that cowardice, that willingness to let Ethan's power go unchecked. "Ethan," Olivia said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He whirled around, surprise flashing across his face before he smothered it with a scowl. "Stay out of this, detective. I've got it under control." His tone was a warning, but Olivia didn't flinch. "No," she said, stepping forward, her authority ringing clear in the single word. "You don't." For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in Ethan's eyes, a crack in the armor of his arrogance, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the stubborn defiance she'd come to know too well. The woman's gaze locked onto Olivia's then, and in those fierce, unyielding eyes, Olivia saw a storm of emotions, fear masked by courage, humiliation warring with pride. It hit her like a wave, stirring something deep and primal within her, a recognition of the injustice playing out, a call to act. The echoes of Ethan's words lingered, heavy and oppressive. A reminder of the warped power dynamics that had festered here for too long. Olivia stood rooted to the spot, facing the man who'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. And she knew this was only the beginning. The station's walls, once sturdy emblems of justice and protection, now seemed to close in around her. Their shadows stretching into something menacing as the truth began to unravel. The tension thickened with every heartbeat, a tangible weight pressing down on them all. This wasn't just about one reckless moment or one man's mistake, it was about the years of unchecked arrogance that had led to it, and the reckoning that loomed on the horizon. Olivia's resolve hardened, steel forming in her spine. She wouldn't let this slide. Ethan straightened, his chest puffing out as if to reclaim the dominance he felt slipping. "I said I've got this handled," he snapped, his voice a jagged edge. Olivia didn't budge. "And I said you don't," she replied, her tone unwavering, a quiet fire burning beneath it. The woman shifted slightly, her breaths shallow but measured, and Olivia's eyes caught the raw marks on her wrists again, vivid streaks of red against pale skin, a map of Ethan's overreach. She could almost feel the sting herself, the indignity of it fueling her anger. The woman's jaw tightened, her composure a fragile shield against the weight of Ethan's scorn. "You think this changes anything?" Ethan growled, turning back to the woman, his words laced with disdain. "You think she's going to swoop in and save you? Let me make this clear, you're not leaving until I get answers." The woman didn't waver. "Answers to what?" she shot back, her voice strained but resolute. "You haven't even asked me a question. All you've done is sling accusations and slap cuffs on me for no reason." Ethan's hand twitched at his side, a telltale sign of his fraying control, and Olivia seized the moment. "Take the cuffs off," she said, her command slicing through the air with precision. Ethan spun toward her, eyes blazing. "What?" "You heard me," Olivia pressed, stepping closer, her voice steady as stone. "Take them off. Now." His glare darkened, a storm brewing behind it, but Olivia held her ground, unflinching. "You're out of line, Ethan," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "You know it. I know it. You don't get to tell me how to do my job." His temper flared. "No, but I do get to tell you when you've gone too far," she cut in, her voice rising with conviction. "And you crossed that line the second you laid hands on her without so much as a question. That ends now." Ethan's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking beneath the skin, but Olivia refused to yield. The woman's eyes met hers again, and in that fleeting connection, Olivia glimpsed something that twisted her heart, a faint ember of hope, buried beneath layers of pain and defiance. Ethan hesitated. His pride warring with the reality of her challenge, then finally moved. His hand trembled as he reached for the key on his belt, fumbling for a moment before unlocking the cuffs. The metal clattered free with a harsh click, and the woman drew her wrists forward, rubbing at the tender, reddened skin. Olivia softened her voice, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" The woman nodded, her gaze flicking briefly to Ethan. "I'll be fine," she said, though the tightness in her tone betrayed the lie. Ethan stepped back, fists curling at his sides. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and bitter. "No," Olivia replied, matching his intensity. "It's not." The woman straightened, her shoulders lifting despite the ache etched into them. And Olivia saw the fire still burning in her eyes, a resilience that refused to be snuffed out. But there was more there too, questions, doubts, a weight that mirrored Olivia's own growing unease. Ethan stormed out, the door slamming behind him with a thunderous bang that reverberated through the room. The sound didn't rattle Olivia. She turned to the woman, her tone gentling. "Let's get you out of here." The woman nodded again, and as they stepped into the hallway, Olivia felt the shift, the stares of the other officers, no longer subtle, the whispers rising like a tide. She saw the judgment in their eyes as they glanced at the woman, the snap decisions made without knowing her story, and it stoked the ember of outrage smoldering in her chest. The precinct, with its faded posters and scuffed floors, felt less like a bastion of justice and more like a cage, its walls complicit in the wrongs it sheltered. When they reached Olivia's office, a small, cluttered space with a single window overlooking the gray dawn, the woman paused at the threshold. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. Olivia shook her head, a wry edge to her words. "Don't thank me yet. This is far from over." The woman's eyes flickered with something akin to relief, but her posture remained taut, a silent acknowledgement of the battle still ahead. Olivia leaned against her desk, watching her closely. She didn't know this woman's full story, not yet, but she could feel the threads of it tugging at her, demanding to be unraveled. The lesson here wasn't just about Ethan's abuse of power, though that was the spark that had ignited this fire. It was about the consequences of letting such arrogance fester, of turning a blind eye until the damage was done. Justice wasn't a passive ideal, it was a fight, one Olivia was ready to wage, no matter how long the shadows stretched. The air in the room hung thick and oppressive, a suffocating blanket that refused to lift even as the woman across from Olivia spoke. Her voice quivering like a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point. Olivia couldn't fault her for the tension that clung to her every word, her every movement, she understood it too well. This wasn't a world where peace came easily or apologies erased the damage. No, moments like these didn't just fade away with time, they burrowed deep, leaving jagged scars that ached with every memory. Olivia sat there, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, feeling the weight of it all settle into her bones as she listened. Ethan wasn't done, she could sense it, a dark undercurrent rippling through the stillness, a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. The tension hadn't dissolved, it lingered, heavy and unyielding, pressing against her chest like a physical force. The woman's story unfolded slowly, each word laced with a quiet, trembling strength that made Olivia's stomach twist. She painted a vivid picture. Ethan's hands, rough and unyielding, clamping down on her arms, twisting them behind her back with a force that spoke of arrogance rather than necessity. Her voice had meant nothing to him, her pleas, her protests, all swallowed by his indifference as he dragged her forward, her wrists burning under his grip. She spoke of the stares that followed, sharp and judgmental, cutting into her like knives, and the suffocating fear that came with realizing no one would intervene. No one had stepped forward to stop him, not a single soul in that crowded precinct had dared to challenge his authority. Olivia felt every syllable like a stone dropping into her gut, each one heavier than the last, piling up until she could barely breathe under the pressure. This wasn't just about Ethan's recklessness anymore, it was something darker, something more insidious. He wasn't merely careless, he was a danger. A man who wielded power like a weapon and left wreckage in his wake. The more the woman spoke, the clearer it became to Olivia that this wasn't an isolated incident, a single lapse in judgment. No. This was a pattern, a thread woven into the fabric of Ethan's existence, hidden until now by the silence of those too afraid or too complicit to speak. The woman's eyes burned with a fire that refused to be extinguished, even as her voice wavered, and Olivia couldn't help but admire her resilience. She sat there, bruised but unbroken, recounting her humiliation with a steadiness that belied the storm raging within her. Olivia's resolve hardened with every passing second, her mind racing as she pieced together the implications. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. It was only the beginning, the first crack in a dam that had held back years of unspoken truths. Justice, she realized, wasn't just about punishment. It was about tearing down the walls that had shielded men like Ethan for far too long. As the minutes dragged on, Olivia's thoughts churned like a restless sea. She imagined the steps ahead. The evidence she'd need to gather, the statements she'd have to record with meticulous care, the witnesses she'd have to coax out of their fearful silence. But above all, her mind kept circling back to Ethan. He had no idea what was coming for him, no inkling of the tempest building just out of sight. He'd grown too comfortable, too certain of his untouchable status. Oblivious to the fact that his reign was crumbling beneath his feet. When the storm finally broke, it would sweep him away, and he'd be left grasping at the ruins of his own making. Olivia almost pitied him, almost. But pity had no place here, not when the cost of his actions had been carved into the lives of others. The precinct that afternoon was unnaturally still. The kind of quiet that felt intentional, as though the building itself held its breath. Olivia stepped out of her office, her boots clicking against the tiled floor. Each sound reverberating through the empty corridors like a declaration of her presence. Conversations hushed as she passed, heads turning away. Eyes avoiding hers as if meeting her gaze might draw them into the fray. The tension hadn't eased, if anything, it had thickened, seeping into the walls. Settling into the crevices like dust after a long neglect. She walked with purpose, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, a silent vow to herself and everyone watching that she wouldn't back down. The air grew denser as she neared the main conference room, where the blinds hung crooked, letting slivers of light spill onto the floor. Muffled voices leaked through the door. A low hum of anticipation that set her nerves alight. She didn't pause, didn't allow herself a moment of doubt. With a steady hand, she pushed the door open, and the room fell silent in an instant. As if her arrival had snuffed out every sound. Ethan stood at the far end, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. Two unfamiliar officers flanked him, their crisp uniforms and the thick files in their hands marking them as outsiders, external investigators, she guessed. Brought in to dissect the mess Ethan had made. Their presence wasn't a coincidence, it was a calculated move, and the realization sent a jolt through Olivia's core. Her stomach tightened. A knot of unease she refused to let show as she stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind her with a soft thud. Ethan's voice sliced through the silence, sharp and mocking. "Glad you could join us, Olivia." His tone dripped with condescension, but she met his stare without flinching, her eyes locking onto his with a steadiness that dared him to push further. "I wasn't aware this meeting had started," she replied coolly, her voice even, betraying none of the fire simmering beneath her surface. He leaned back against the table, a smirk tugging at his lips. "We didn't think you'd need an invitation, considering the circumstances." One of the investigators, a wiry man with graying hair, cleared his throat and stepped forward. His presence cutting through Ethan's bravado. "Detective Hayes," he began, his tone formal but firm, "we're here to conduct a thorough review of the incident earlier this week. We've received multiple statements, and we're in the process of collecting evidence." Olivia didn't react outwardly. Though she felt the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on her like a physical force. She knew how this looked, Ethan, smug and defiant, painting her as the instigator, the troublemaker. But she also knew the truth, a weapon he couldn't wield, and that knowledge steadied her. The investigator flipped through his file, his fingers methodical. "The claims against Officer Wallace are serious. Given the nature of the accusations, we need full transparency. We'll be speaking with both of you individually." Ethan's smirk widened. A flash of confidence. "I have nothing to hide." Olivia held his gaze, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Neither do I." For a fleeting moment, Ethan's smirk wavered. A crack in his armor so brief she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching so closely. Doubt flickered in his eyes. A shadow of uncertainty that told her he wasn't as sure of himself as he pretended to be. The investigators began their questioning, and Olivia answered with precision, her words deliberate. Leaving no room for misinterpretation. She recounted every detail with a clarity that anchored the room, her voice steady as stone. Ethan, though, was different. At first. He spoke with the same bravado, his tone smooth and rehearsed, but as the questions dug deeper, his facade began to fracture. His answers grew shorter, his voice tighter, the cracks widening with every probe. Then the woman entered, the one Ethan had wronged, her posture rigid but her presence commanding. She sat across from him, her eyes boring into his with an intensity that crackled in the air. Olivia felt the shift, a charge like static before a lightning strike. Ethan leaned back in his chair, trying to reclaim his dominance. "I acted on instinct," he said, his voice firm but hollow. "I saw someone in a restricted area without ID, and I followed protocol." The woman's response was immediate, her voice slicing through his excuse like a shard of glass. "Protocol?" Her tone sharpened, her eyes narrowing. "So protocol includes handcuffing someone without asking for identification? Dragging them through the station in front of their peers? Ignoring every word they say because you've already decided who they are?" Ethan's mouth opened, but no sound came out, his confidence crumbling under the weight of her words. Olivia leaned forward, her voice low but piercing. "That's what we're all trying to understand here, Ethan. Because what I see isn't protocol, I see an abuse of power." His face hardened, his eyes flashing with anger. "Don't talk to me about power, Olivia. You're the one who's been walking around here like you own the place, making decisions that affect all of us without a thought for the consequences." The room fell silent, the heat of his bitterness hanging in the air like smoke. But Olivia didn't falter. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "It's about what you did, and whether you're willing to face the consequences. Or are you so convinced of your own authority that you think you're untouchable?" Ethan's voice rose, a desperate edge creeping in. "I've earned my place here." The woman cut in, her tone steady but sharp enough to slice through his outburst. "And so have I. But you treated me like I didn't belong." He turned toward her, his mouth opening to retort, but Olivia's voice stopped him cold. "You still don't get it, do you?" His head snapped back to her, his eyes blazing. "Get what?" She leaned closer, her words deliberate, each one landing like a blow. "That this isn't your precinct anymore, not the way you thought it was." His face paled, the realization sinking in like a stone dropping into deep water. This wasn't just about one incident, it was about everything he'd done, the complaints buried under layers of silence. The patterns of behavior that could no longer be ignored. The investigators weren't here to shield him, they were here to unravel him. The woman stood, stepping closer, her voice quiet but resonant. "You looked at me and saw what you wanted to see. And because of that, you lost everything you thought you had." Ethan tried to speak, but his voice caught, a choked sound that betrayed his unraveling. Olivia rose too, her gaze unwavering. "This investigation isn't over," she said. "But your career? It might be." The room felt like it was closing in, the weight of every word suffocating, the air thick with the fallout of what had just transpired. Ethan sat frozen, his hands gripping the table's edge, his knuckles white as bone. His breathing was shallow, ragged, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him. His eyes darted around, searching for an ally, a lifeline. But found only silence, a silence that roared louder than any accusation. Olivia watched him, her heart steady despite the chaos. This was the turning point. The moment the scales of power tipped irrevocably. Ethan had ruled through fear and force, but that era was ending. The storm was still building, gathering strength, and when it crashed down, it would leave nothing of his world intact. Justice, she thought, wasn't just retribution, it was the consequence of believing you could bend the world to your will without ever facing the reckoning. The walls of the room seemed to press inward, suffocating Ethan as he stood there, trapped beneath the weight of Olivia's unwavering gaze. She was positioned across from him, her eyes piercing into his soul like twin daggers, refusing to grant him even a sliver of reprieve. There was no gleam of victory in her expression. No subtle curl of satisfaction tugging at her lips, just a steely determination, forged in the fire of a truth that had clawed its way to the surface. It was a truth so raw, so jagged, that it left no room for pretense, exposing every lie Ethan had clung to like a lifeline. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice fractured, a brittle sound that shattered in the air. Swallowing hard, he forced the lump in his throat down, desperation clawing at his chest as he tried again. "You're making a mistake," he rasped, but the words felt hollow. Stripped of the authority they once carried, they landed like dead leaves on the floor, lifeless and unconvincing, as if even he could no longer muster faith in his own defense. "I didn't, this isn't what it looks like," he stammered, his voice trembling with the weight of a man grasping at crumbling excuses. Across the table, the woman sat like a statue carved from stone. Her posture rigid, her shoulders squared against the storm of emotions brewing inside her. Her eyes, sharp, unrelenting, and brimming with a quiet fury, never wavered from Ethan's face. She had endured every second of this ordeal with a resilience that bordered on superhuman, holding herself together through the barrage of accusations and denials. But Olivia could see it now. The faint cracks in her armor, the way her hands quivered ever so slightly as they gripped the edge of her chair, the Herculean effort it took to keep her voice from breaking. "Stop," she said at last, her tone low but laced with an unyielding strength. "Just stop. I'm exhausted from hearing your excuses, from watching you twist this into some innocent mistake. You didn't stumble into this, Ethan. You chose it. You didn't see me as a human being with rights, with feelings. You saw me as an obstacle, something to control, to silence." Her words cut through the air like a blade, each syllable heavy with the pain she'd carried for far too long. Ethan's jaw tightened, a flicker of defiance flashing in his eyes. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though he might lash out, his temper flaring like a cornered animal. But then, just as quickly, the fire guttered out. His shoulders slumped, and he sank back into his chair, a sharp exhale escaping his lips as if the last vestiges of resistance had been wrung from his body. "You don't get it," he muttered, shaking his head, his voice tinged with a bitter edge. "You don't know what it's like to step into a room and feel every pair of eyes boring into you, waiting for you to slip up. You don't know what it's like to live under that kind of scrutiny, knowing they've already decided you're guilty before you've even opened your mouth." His words hung in the air, fragile and tinged with self-pity, but they did little to sway the woman across from him. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into slits of barely contained rage. "You think I don't understand that?" she shot back, her voice rising with a ferocity that made the room feel smaller. "You think I haven't spent every single day of my career battling to be taken seriously, fighting to prove I'm more than just a placeholder, a token to make someone else feel progressive? You think I don't know what it's like to walk into a room and feel every stare dissecting me, waiting for me to falter so they can say, 'See, she doesn't belong'? Don't you dare sit there and tell me I don't get it, Ethan." Her words trembled with the weight of years of struggle, a lifetime of pushing against a world that refused to see her worth. For the first time, Ethan couldn't hold her gaze. His eyes dropped to the table, tracing the worn grain of the wood as if it might offer him an escape. Olivia, standing silently until now, saw the shift in him, the moment when the facade he'd built began to crumble. The cracks that had been forming beneath his bravado split wide open, and the anger, the defensiveness, the arrogance that had defined him slipped away like sand through his fingers. What remained was something vulnerable, something broken, a man stripped bare by the consequences of his own actions. The investigator, a wiry man with graying hair and a voice that carried the calm authority of someone who'd seen it all, stepped forward from the shadows of the room. "Officer Wallace," he began, his tone measured but firm, "this isn't just about what happened here today. We've gone through your record, multiple complaints, most of them swept under the rug or quietly dismissed. But there's a pattern here, a trail of behavior we can't ignore any longer. This isn't a one-off mistake, it's a symptom of something bigger, something systemic. And it's not something we can turn a blind eye to. His words landed like a gavel, final and unyielding, sealing Ethan's fate in a way his own excuses never could. Ethan's head jerked up, his voice rising in a sudden burst of desperation. "You're making it sound like I'm some kind of monster," he protested, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "I've poured my life into this job. I've done everything they asked of me, put myself in harm's way every single day. And this is what I get? This is my reward?" His voice cracked, teetering on the edge of hysteria, but it was met with no sympathy. Olivia stepped closer, her presence commanding the room as her voice cut through his outburst like a whip. "No one's denying your service, Ethan," she said, her tone sharp and unapologetic. "But wearing that badge doesn't give you a free pass to abuse your power. You don't get to hide behind it and pretend you're untouchable. That uniform, that authority, it's supposed to hold you to a higher standard, not shield you from accountability. And you didn't just fall short of that standard, you trampled it into the dirt." Her words were a lesson in justice, a reminder that power unchecked is a poison that corrupts not just the wielder, but everyone it touches. Ethan's hands balled tighter, his knuckles widening as he grappled with her words. "I made a mistake, okay," he snapped, his voice rising in a last-ditch effort to reclaim control. "Is that what you want me to say? I messed up. But it wasn't personal, I didn't mean it like that." The woman's voice sliced through his plea, raw and trembling with emotion. "It was personal," she said, her eyes blazing with a fire that refused to be extinguished. "Whether you intended it or not, it was personal to me. It was personal when you looked at me and decided I didn't belong, when you dismissed my voice like it was nothing. It was personal when you slapped those cuffs on my wrists and dragged me through the station like I was some common criminal, not a colleague, not a person. You humiliated me, Ethan. You stripped me of my dignity because you thought you had the right to. And now you're sitting there, acting like you're the one who's been wronged?" Her voice broke, a single tear slipping down her cheek, but she pressed on, her resolve unshaken. "That's what power does when you misuse it, it doesn't just hurt, it destroys." Ethan's shoulders sagged again, the fight draining from him like water from a cracked vessel. For the first time, he had no rebuttal, no clever deflection to throw back. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them all like a heavy fog. The investigator spoke again, his voice cutting through the stillness with a finality that brooked no argument. "Officer Wallace. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending the outcome of this investigation. Further disciplinary action, up to and including termination, will be determined based on what we uncover." His words were a death knell to Ethan's career, a stark reminder that actions have consequences, no matter how deeply one believes they're justified. Ethan's head snapped up, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "Suspended," he echoed, his voice hollow. He shoved his chair back abruptly, the screech of metal against the floor grating against the silence. His eyes burned as they locked onto Olivia, a storm of rage and humiliation swirling within them. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. Olivia didn't flinch, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his unraveling. "This was never about winning, Ethan," she replied, her voice steady and resolute. "This was about doing what's right, something you should have considered before you let your ego and your badge dictate your choices." Her words were a mirror held up to his failures, reflecting the hard truth that justice, when ignored, demands a reckoning. Ethan's gaze darted around the room, searching for an ally, a lifeline, anything to pull him from the abyss he'd fallen into. But the faces around him were impassive, their eyes averted, offering no refuge. The silence was deafening, a void that swallowed his pleas whole. With a final, furious glance at Olivia. He turned on his heel and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him with a thunderous bang that echoed through the precinct like a gunshot. The woman exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since the confrontation began. She turned to Olivia, her voice softening, tinged with a gratitude she couldn't fully articulate. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything she'd endured. Olivia shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips. "This isn't over yet," she said, her tone pragmatic but laced with hope. "But it's a start." They stood together in the quiet, the air thick with the aftermath of what had just transpired. Then, side by side, they walked out, leaving the room, and the ghosts of that moment, behind them. But as they moved down the dimly lit hallway of the precinct, Olivia felt the day's toll pressing down on her like a physical weight. The victory, if it could be called that, was bittersweet. Ethan wasn't the type to slink away quietly. His pride, wounded and festering, would drive him to retaliate. The storm he'd unleashed was far from spent, its dark clouds still looming on the horizon. Yet beneath the exhaustion, Olivia felt something else stirring, a spark of purpose. A resolve that burned brighter with every step. This wasn't just about Ethan, she knew. It was about the rotten culture that had enabled him. The systems that propped up men like him while silencing their victims. She was ready to dismantle those systems, brick by brick, until justice wasn't just a word but a reality. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. One battle had ended, its echoes still reverberating through the precinct's halls, but another loomed ahead, larger and more daunting. The air felt charged. Different, electric with the promise of change and the uncertainty of what lay beyond. Olivia could sense it in the lingering stares of her colleagues. The hushed whispers that fell silent as she passed. People were watching, waiting to see how the cracks in the department's foundation would widen, what truths would spill out from the fractures. Back in her office, she closed the door behind her, the soft click of the latch a brief reprieve from the chaos outside. Leaning against her desk, she let out a slow, steadying breath. The reality of the day sinking into her bones. Ethan was gone, for now, but his shadow lingered, a specter of unfinished business. There were too many loose threads, too many questions left unanswered, for this to feel like a conclusion. Near the window, the woman stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her reflection a ghostly silhouette in the glass. She stared out at the darkening sky, but her eyes were distant, lost in a tangle of thoughts Olivia couldn't begin to unravel. The silence between them grew heavy, pressing down like a storm about to break. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier fire. "Do you think he'll come back?" Olivia paused, weighing her response. She wanted to offer comfort, to say no and banish the fear that lingered in the woman's question. But she couldn't lie, not about this. "He's suspended," she said at last, her tone careful but firm. "That gives us some time. But men like Ethan don't let go easily. He's angry, humiliated, and that makes him unpredictable, dangerous, even." She stepped closer, meeting the woman's gaze. "But whatever happens next, he doesn't get to walk away from this unscathed. I won't let that happen." The woman turned to face her, her eyes searching Olivia's face for something, reassurance. Perhaps, or a promise she could cling to. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of their shared resolve filling the space between them. Outside, the precinct buzzed with muted tension. A hive of uncertainty and unspoken questions. Inside, Olivia felt the ember of her purpose flare brighter. This was more than a single confrontation, more than one man's downfall. It was a lesson in justice, a warning of the consequences that follow when power is wielded without conscience. And Olivia was ready to see it through. No matter how long the fight or how fierce the storm ahead. The flicker of something, perhaps certainty, perhaps a fragile thread of hope, glimmered in the woman's eyes as she studied Olivia's face. Whatever she found there seemed to soothe her, if only by the smallest measure. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, a storm of emotions still raging beneath her composed exterior. Then, without so much as a creak of warning, the door swung open, slicing through the fragile quiet. One of the investigators stepped inside, his broad frame filling the doorway. His face was a mask of stern resolve, his brows furrowed, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and deliberate. His gaze darted between the two women, lingering for a moment on each as if weighing their strength for what was to come. "Ethan's already stirring things up. He's pushing back hard, claims this is all retaliation. Says he's being singled out unfairly. He's not going down quietly." Olivia felt her jaw clench, the muscles tightening like a coiled spring, but she forced herself to breathe, to keep the rising tide of frustration in check. Her voice came out steady, measured, a quiet defiance woven into every word. "Let him push all he wants. We've got the evidence, solid, irrefutable. We've got the statements, the witnesses. He doesn't get to rewrite the story just because he doesn't like how it ends." The investigator nodded, a faint dip of his head. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt that gnawed at Olivia's confidence. He shifted his weight, his boots scuffing faintly against the worn linoleum floor. "You need to brace yourself," he warned, his tone heavy with unspoken implications. "This isn't just about Ethan anymore. It's bigger than him, it's the whole department now, the politics of it all. People are already choosing sides, drawing lines in the sand." The woman, Danielle, snapped her head up, her voice cutting through the thick tension like a blade. "And where do you stand?" Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, demanding an answer. The investigator hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor for a split second before he lifted it to meet hers. "I'm on the side of the truth," he said, his voice firm but tinged with something weary, something resigned. "But truth doesn't always come out on top in a place like this." Olivia stepped forward, her posture rigid, her voice rising with a quiet, unshakable conviction. "It will this time." The investigator held her stare for a long, heavy moment, searching her face as if trying to gauge the depth of her resolve. Then, with a curt nod, he turned and slipped out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound that echoed like a gavel. Danielle turned to Olivia, her movements slow, deliberate, as if every step carried the weight of her doubts. "Do you really believe that? That the truth is enough to fix this?" Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the vulnerability she fought so hard to hide. Olivia paused, her breath catching for just a heartbeat. "I have to," she said finally, her tone soft but resolute. "If I don't believe that, then what's the point of any of this?" Danielle didn't reply, but the tight knot of tension in her shoulders loosened ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement of Olivia's words. For Olivia, it was a fleeting triumph, a glimmer of connection in the midst of chaos. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into eternity, yet the oppressive weight of the day refused to lift. Olivia stayed late, her desk a battlefield of scattered reports and scribbled notes. The dim light of her lamp cast long shadows across the room, pooling in the corners like ink. She pored over every detail, her fingers tracing lines of text as she prepared for the fight she knew loomed on the horizon, a battle not just against Ethan, but against the system that had shielded him for far too long. Across from her, Danielle sat hunched over a stack of files, her hands moving mechanically as she offered what help she could. But Olivia could see the exhaustion creeping into her frame, the way her shoulders sagged, the way her eyes fluttered with the effort of staying awake. Finally, Olivia set her pen down, the soft clink against the desk breaking the silence. "You should go home," she said gently, her voice cutting through the stillness. Get some rest. Danielle shook her head, her hair falling across her face like a curtain. Not yet. I can't leave until I know how this ends. Her words were stubborn, but her tone wavered, a crack in her armor. Olivia leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. We'll know soon enough. But you've got to take care of yourself too. You're no good to anyone if you collapse. Danielle hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of a file as she wrestled with the idea of stepping away. Then, reluctantly, she nodded. Promise me this won't get swept under the rug, she said, her eyes locking onto Olivia's with a fierce intensity. Olivia didn't flinch. I promise, she replied, her voice a vow carved in stone. Danielle gathered her things slowly, her movements heavy with reluctance, and left the office. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, leaving Olivia alone in the suffocating silence. She sat there, surrounded by the sprawl of papers, the walls seeming to press in closer with every passing second. The shadows grew darker, thicker, as if they were swallowing the light whole. Her mind churned, replaying the choices that had led her here, the missteps, the compromises, the truths she'd turned a blind eye to for too long. And then there was Ethan, his furious glare burned into her memory, his voice dripping with desperation as he clung to his crumbling empire. The shrill ring of the phone shattered her reverie, and she snatched it up, her heart thudding against her ribs. The voice on the other end was clipped, urgent. You need to get down here. Now. She didn't waste time with questions. Grabbing her coat, she moved swiftly, her boots echoing against the hardwood floor as she strode out into the night. Her pulse raced, a frantic drumbeat in her chest, as she navigated the familiar streets to the precinct. When she arrived, the scene hit her like a punch. Patrol cars lined the lot, their red and blue lights slicing through the darkness, casting jagged shadows across the asphalt. Officers milled about near the station's entrance, their voices a low hum of tension, their faces etched with strain. Olivia pushed through the crowd, her shoulders squared, her jaw set. Until she saw him. Ethan stood near one of the squad cars, his silhouette framed by the pulsing lights. His voice was a raw, jagged thing, tearing through the night as he shouted at the officers encircling him. This isn't over, he roared, his eyes wild with a mix of rage and panic. You think you've won? You think this is going to stick? The officers didn't flinch, their hands steady as they closed in, but Ethan's gaze snapped to Olivia as she approached. You, he spat, his voice dripping with venom. You're going to regret this. She met his stare head-on, unflinching, her voice calm but laced with steel. Step back, Ethan. This isn't going to end the way you want it to. His laughter was a bitter, broken sound, sharp enough to cut. It already hasn't. But you'll see. All of you will. The officers moved then, swift and decisive, seizing his arms as he thrashed against their grip. His resistance was fierce but fleeting, the last embers of his defiance flickering out as the fight drained from his body. What remained was a hollow shell of anger and fear, a man undone by his own hubris. Olivia watched as they led him away, his shouts fading into the night like a dying echo. She turned to one of the officers, a young man with tired eyes and a clenched jaw. Make sure he's processed properly, she said, her tone leaving no room for error. No shortcuts. He nodded. But the unease in his expression told her what she already knew, this wasn't the end. Ethan might be gone from the building, but the rot he'd left behind wouldn't vanish so easily. The cold night air bit at Olivia's skin as she lingered outside the station, watching the final squad car disappear into the distance. The flashing lights dwindled to pinpricks, then vanished entirely, but the tension clung to her like damp cloth, heavy and unyielding. Her thoughts spun in a relentless whirl, Ethan's downfall, the fragile hope of justice, the cost of it all. There was no time to linger on it, no space for doubt. She turned back toward the precinct, her steps deliberate, her breath fogging in the frigid air. Inside, the hallways felt eerily empty. The energy of the night sucked dry. Whispers followed her as she passed, soft murmurs from colleagues, their eyes darting toward her with a mix of fear, uncertainty, and something else. Something she hadn't expected, a quiet, grudging respect. When she reached her office, Danielle was already there, pacing the cramped space with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her movements were restless, her shoulders stiff despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She stopped abruptly as Olivia entered, her eyes sharp and searching. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice taut with hope and dread. Olivia shook her head, sinking into her chair with a weary sigh. "Not yet. He's in custody, but this isn't the end. He'll keep fighting. And people will keep questioning everything we've done." Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line, her frustration boiling over. "I can't believe he still thinks he's the victim. After everything he did, everything he said, he still doesn't see it." Olivia leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk, her voice soft but steady. "He doesn't want to see it. Admitting the truth means admitting he's not the man he built himself up to be, and that's a harder fall than blaming everyone else." Danielle shook her head, her hands clenching into fists. "I don't care what's hard for him. I don't care how he feels. I care about what he did to me, what he took from me. I want to know he's going to pay for it." Her voice cracked. A raw edge of pain slicing through her anger. Olivia held her gaze, unflinching. "He will. But it's not going to happen overnight. You know how this works, he'll twist the narrative, play the martyr. But we've got the truth, and no matter how loud he screams, he can't erase it." Danielle's eyes blazed, a storm of fury and fear swirling within them. What if the truth isn't enough? What if they believe him? Her voice trembled, the weight of her doubt pressing down on every word. Olivia softened, her tone gentle but firm. "Then we keep pushing. We remind them of the facts. Of what he did. We don't let them forget. He doesn't get to control this story, not anymore." Danielle looked away, her jaw tight as she battled the tears threatening to spill. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "You know what the worst part was? It wasn't the cuffs cutting into my wrists. It wasn't even the way he dragged me through the station like I was less than nothing. It was the way everyone else just stood there. Watching. Doing nothing. Like it didn't matter." Olivia's stomach twisted, a familiar ache blooming in her chest. She knew that betrayal, the sting of silence, the cowardice of those too afraid to act. They were scared, she said quietly. Scared of him, scared of the consequences if they stepped in. Danielle's voice sharpened, her anger flaring anew. "And what about me? Where was their fear for what happened to me? Where was their courage then?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, a stark reminder of the cost of apathy. Olivia didn't have the words to heal that wound, but she felt its depth. Its jagged edges cutting into them both. In that moment, the lesson crystallized for Olivia: justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about confronting the systems that let them thrive. Ethan's abuse of power had thrived in the shadows of fear and complicity, and its consequences rippled far beyond his own downfall. For Danielle, it was personal, a wound carved into her soul by betrayal and indifference. For Olivia, it was a call to arms, a vow to keep fighting, no matter how messy or exhausting the battle became. The night stretched on, the walls of the office closing in, but Olivia stood firm, her resolve unshaken. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore, it was about the truth, about accountability. And about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what Danielle had. And she wasn't done yet. In the dimly lit precinct, the air hung thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to cling to every corner of the room. Olivia edged closer to Danielle, her voice a quiet but resolute murmur cutting through the stillness. "You're absolutely right, they should have acted sooner, done more to stop it. And that's precisely why this fight matters so much. What you went through can't be allowed to repeat itself, not here. Not anywhere." Her words carried a weight born of conviction, a promise etched into the very tone of her voice. Danielle's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, glistening like fragile glass under the fluorescent lights. She blinked hard, forcing them back, her jaw clenching tight as she wrestled with the storm brewing inside her. "I just want him to know what it's like," she said, her voice low and raw, each syllable trembling with pent-up fury. "I want him to feel that same helplessness. To understand how it eats you alive when you're powerless." The words spilled out like a confession, heavy with the pain she'd carried for far too long. Olivia's expression softened, her gaze steady as she stepped even closer, bridging the space between them with quiet empathy. "He will, Danielle. Trust me, he's already starting to feel it. But this isn't just about him anymore. It's about making damn sure no one else has to endure what you did." Her voice was a lifeline, firm yet tender, pulling Danielle back from the edge of despair. Danielle gave a small, hesitant nod. But Olivia could see the fire still smoldering in her eyes. The battle wasn't over, not for Danielle, not yet. And Olivia understood that all too well. The anger, the hurt, the desperate hunger for justice, they weren't fleeting emotions. They sank deep, rooting themselves into the marrow, a relentless ache that refused to fade with time. The door swung open abruptly, shattering the fragile quiet. One of the investigators stepped inside, his face etched with a grimness that made the room feel colder. His name was Mark. A seasoned officer with graying temples and a perpetually tired slump to his shoulders. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice a low rumble, barely concealing the unease beneath it. "Ethan's lawyer just dropped a formal complaint, unlawful detention, discrimination, the works. They're pushing for his immediate reinstatement while the review drags on." Danielle's eyes widened, a flicker of panic darting across her face as the words sank in. Olivia felt her pulse spike, a sharp jolt racing through her veins, but she masked it behind a calm exterior. "Let them push," she said, her tone unwavering, a steel thread running through it. "We're not backing down." Mark hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his brow furrowing. "You need to brace yourselves, this is going to get messy. Uglier than it already is." Olivia met his gaze and nodded, her resolve unshaken. "It's been ugly from the start." As Mark slipped back out, leaving the door to creak shut behind him, Danielle's voice trembled, breaking the silence. "You promised me he wouldn't get away with this." Her words hung in the air, fragile and accusatory. A plea wrapped in fear. Olivia stepped closer, her presence a quiet anchor. "And I meant it. But you've got to trust me, this isn't over." Danielle's eyes searched Olivia's face, tracing every line, every flicker of determination. For the first time, Olivia glimpsed something beyond the raw anger, a faint, fragile spark of trust. It was tentative, easily shattered, but it was there. Danielle sank into a chair, her hands fidgeting with the frayed edge of her sleeve, while Olivia turned back to her desk, her mind already spinning through the next moves in this unrelenting chess game. The fight was far from finished, and Olivia knew the road ahead would only grow steeper. But this wasn't just about Ethan anymore, it was about the rotten culture that had shielded him, the deafening silence that had let him thrive. Olivia was determined to shatter that silence. To wage this war not just for Danielle but for every soul who'd ever been crushed under the weight of powerlessness. She glanced back at Danielle, her voice steady as stone. "We're going to see this through. And when it's done, no one will forget what happened here." Danielle nodded, and Olivia saw the resolve hardening in her eyes. Fear still lingered. A shadow at the edges, but it no longer held the reins. The night stretched on, heavy and endless, cloaking the precinct in an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles after a storm but never fully dissipates. Olivia stood by the window of her cramped office, staring out at the darkened parking lot. Her faint reflection stared back, a ghostly outline against the glass, her features taut with exhaustion. The tension in her chest hadn't eased since this ordeal began, every heated exchange, every pointed accusation, every suffocating pause had carved itself into her thoughts, leaving her restless, teetering on the edge of doubt. Behind her, Danielle sat slouched in a worn chair, her fingers twisting nervously at the hem of her sleeve, unraveling threads with every anxious tug. She'd been silent since Mark's departure, but her presence filled the room. A quiet storm of expectation and dread. Finally, her voice broke through, soft and unsteady. "What happens now?" Olivia turned, her gaze cautious but firm. "Now we wait. Internal Affairs has everything they need to push forward, but Ethan's not going down without a hell of a fight." Danielle shook her head, her voice sharpening with frustration. "He shouldn't even get the chance to fight. He should be gone by now. People like him don't deserve to just walk away from what they've done." Olivia stepped closer, her tone gentle yet unyielding. "I know exactly how you feel, I feel it too. But the system doesn't always move at the speed we want. That doesn't mean we're not getting somewhere." Danielle's eyes flashed, her frustration boiling over. "Somewhere? He's still out there, Olivia. He's still twisting this, playing the victim, and the worst part? People are buying it." Olivia's jaw tightened, a flicker of her own anger surfacing. "They're listening because it's easier to swallow his lies than face the ugly truth. If they admit what he did, they'd have to own up to their part in it, the silence that let it happen, the cowardice that kept it buried. They'd rather bury you instead." Danielle leaned forward, her voice quaking with emotion. "And what about me? Where does that leave me? I'm the one who had to stand there while he stripped me of everything, my voice, my dignity. I'm the one who has to live with that every single day." Olivia knelt beside her, meeting her gaze head-on. "It leaves you here, fighting back, refusing to let him win. And it leaves me right here with you." Tears welled in Danielle's eyes again. But she blinked them away fiercely, her voice cracking. "What if that's not enough?" Olivia's tone softened, a quiet strength threading through it. "Then we keep going anyway. Because the only way he wins is if we give up." Danielle's breath hitched, shaky and uneven, but she managed a whisper. "I don't want him to win." Olivia reached out, her hand closing gently around Danielle's trembling fingers. "He won't." The door creaked open again, and Mark reappeared, his expression darker than before. He shut the door with a deliberate thud. A thick folder clutched in his hand, its weight seeming to drag his arm down. He tossed it onto the desk, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "Ethan's legal team just filed another motion," he said, his voice low and guarded. "They're doubling down, claiming the department's biased, that the whole investigation's a sham. They're pushing hard now." Danielle stiffened, her voice slicing through the air. "Biased? He's the one who—" Olivia cut her off gently, her hand still resting on Danielle's. "They're trying to muddy the waters. Turn it into a circus instead of facts. It's a distraction." Mark nodded, his tired eyes flicking between them. "And it might work. There's pressure coming from upstairs to sweep this under the rug, quietly. They're scared of the fallout." Danielle's voice trembled with disbelief. Fallout? What about the fallout if they let him walk? What does that say to everyone else he's hurt? Olivia stepped in before Mark could reply, her tone fierce. That's not happening. We're not letting this go. I don't care who's pulling strings. We didn't come this far to fold now. Mark hesitated, rubbing a hand across his stubbled jaw, then gave a curt nod. I'll keep digging. But you two need to steel yourselves. Ethan's not going quietly. Olivia's voice was a blade, sharp and steady. Neither are we. When Mark left, the silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on them like a physical force. Danielle slumped back in her chair, exhaustion finally overtaking her, while Olivia sat across from her, leaning forward with quiet intensity. You're not alone in this, Olivia said, her words cutting through the gloom. No matter how hard they push, I'm not leaving you to face it by yourself. Danielle looked up, her voice raw and frayed. I don't know if I can keep doing this. Olivia's gaze softened, but her tone held firm. You can. And you're not doing it alone. Danielle's hands shook as she wiped at her eyes, her voice barely audible. I keep hearing him in my head, every word, every smirk. It's like he's still here, still winning. Olivia leaned closer, her voice a gentle but unyielding force. That's how people like him hold power, they make you feel small, like you're the one who's broken. But you're not. He doesn't own you anymore, you do. Danielle's eyes locked with hers, a tangle of anger and fear warring within them. Then why do I still feel like I'm nothing? Olivia's voice dropped, fierce and certain. Because that's what he wanted you to feel. That's how he kept you under his thumb. But he's not in control now, you are. The room seemed to shrink around them, the weight of their words filling the space. Outside, the night pressed on, indifferent to their struggle, but within these walls, something shifted. Danielle's fight wasn't just her own anymore, it was a reckoning, a stand against the abuse of power and the cost of silence. Olivia knew the lesson here ran deeper than one man's crimes. It was about justice, about the consequences of letting power go unchecked. And as the battle loomed larger, she was ready to see it through, not just for Danielle, but for the truth that deserved to be heard. Olivia's voice sliced through the heavy air of the room, steady as a blade despite the storm brewing inside her. I want to believe he's not going to win, she said, her words deliberate, each one a quiet hammer striking against the doubt that hung between them. She looked at Danielle, whose slow nod betrayed the flicker of uncertainty still dancing in her eyes. Olivia could see it plainly, the way Danielle's gaze wavered, caught between hope and the shadows of fear that had haunted her for too long. They sat there, the silence stretching taut, a fragile thread ready to snap. Then the phone rang, its shrill cry shattering the stillness like glass. Olivia's hand darted for it, her movements quick and sure, as if she'd been waiting for something, anything, to pull her out of the mire of her thoughts. The voice on the other end was clipped and urgent, a man named Burnett barking orders through the static. You need to get down here. Now. There was no room for questions, no time for hesitation. Olivia was on her feet in an instant, her chair scraping against the floor as she gestured to Danielle with a sharp tilt of her head. Let's go. Danielle's heart thudded hard against her ribs as she followed, her pulse a wild drumbeat echoing in her ears. The station's hallways seemed to close in around them, the walls looming tighter with every step, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead like a warning. To Danielle, it felt as though the building itself was holding its breath, steeling itself for the chaos that waited beyond its doors. Her shoes clicked against the worn tile, each sound swallowed by the murmur of distant voices and the hum of tension that permeated the air. When they reached the front lobby, the scene hit Danielle like a punch to the chest. Flashing red and blue lights spilled through the windows, painting the room in jagged streaks of color. A cluster of officers stood near the entrance. Their faces grim, their postures rigid with purpose. Outside, Ethan's voice rose above the din, sharp and jagged as broken glass, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic, desperate rush. Danielle's breath caught in her throat, her eyes darting to Olivia, who moved forward with a calm that belied the storm brewing beneath her surface. Olivia's shoulders were taut, her jaw set. But her expression remained a mask, unreadable to anyone who didn't know her well enough to see the cracks. Ethan stood in the center of it all, surrounded by officers who watched him with cool detachment. His hair was disheveled, his tie askew, and his eyes burned with a wild, unhinged fire. He shouted at no one in particular, his voice cracking with every syllable, but the officers didn't flinch. Olivia stepped into the fray, her presence cutting through the noise like a lighthouse-piercing fog. "That's enough," she said, her tone low but carrying the weight of a gavel striking wood. Ethan whirled to face her, his face twisting with fury and something darker, panic, perhaps. Or the dawning realization that his grip on power was slipping through his fingers like sand. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You think this is over?" Olivia didn't blink, didn't recoil. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on his, steady and unyielding. "It's over, Ethan," she said, her words measured but firm. "Walk away before you make this worse." His laughter erupted then, harsh and bitter, a sound that clawed at the air. "Worse?" he echoed, his voice rising to a near hysterical pitch. "This is already worse, and it's because of you." His finger jabbed toward her, trembling with rage, but before Olivia could respond, Danielle stepped forward. Her legs felt like lead, her chest tight with the weight of her own fear, but her voice, shaky at first, rang out with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "No," she said, her eyes meeting Ethan's. "It's because of you." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Ethan's gaze snapped to her, and Olivia saw it, the flicker of terror in his eyes. The sudden understanding that he was losing everything he'd fought to hold on to. His control, his authority, his carefully constructed world, it was all unraveling, thread by thread. The officers moved in then, their voices calm but edged with steel as they closed ranks around him. Ethan's defiance crumbled, his shoulders slumping as they guided him away, his footsteps dragging against the pavement. Danielle's breath came in uneven gasps, but when Olivia looked at her, she saw something new in her friend's eyes, resolve, hard-earned and unshakable. "It's over," Olivia said quietly, placing a hand on Danielle's shoulder. The touch was light but grounding, a tether in the chaos. Danielle nodded, her lips trembling as she fought to steady herself. "Almost," Olivia added, her voice tinged with something solemn. "But we're not done yet." Days later, the courtroom was a crucible of tension. Every corner packed with onlookers whose eyes glittered with a mix of curiosity, judgment, and barely concealed anticipation. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of the crowd, the air thick with the scent of polished oak and nervous sweat. Olivia sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture straight but her fingers drumming a silent rhythm against the wood, a rare tell of the nerve she kept buried deep. Beside her, Danielle sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her nails biting into her palms until faint crescents bloomed against her skin. Her face was pale, her breath shallow, but her eyes burned with a quiet fire, a determination that refused to be extinguished. When the judge entered, the room fell silent, the rustle of papers and whispers dying away as if snuffed out by his presence. He was an older man, his face lined with years of hard decisions, his robes hanging heavy on his frame. Olivia felt the weight of every moment that had brought them here pressing down on her, a physical force that made her shoulders ache. She stole a glance at Danielle, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod, a lifeline in the storm. Danielle returned it. Her lips twitching in the ghost of a smile, and in that fleeting exchange, they anchored each other. Across the room, Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his suit impeccably pressed. His posture rigid with defiance. But Olivia knew him too well to miss the signs, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his hands flexed and unflexed at his sides. The arrogance that had once defined him was fraying, replaced by a raw, gnawing desperation. He was a man watching his empire crumble, brick by brick, and there was nowhere left to hide. The judge's gavel fell, and the trial began. The prosecutor, a wiry man with a voice like gravel, laid out the case with ruthless precision. Evidence stacked upon evidence, documents, recordings. Timelines, each piece a chisel chipping away at the flimsy defenses Ethan's lawyer scrambled to erect. Witnesses took the stand one by one, their voices weaving a tapestry of condemnation. There was Officer Harris, a grizzled veteran with a limp and a no-nonsense glare, who recounted Ethan's threats with a weary disgust. Then came Maria. A soft-spoken clerk whose hands shook as she described the late-night calls, the veiled warnings, the fear that had kept her silent for years. Each story built on the last. Painting a portrait of a man who had wielded his badge like a weapon, crushing anyone who dared to defy him. Olivia's turn came next. She rose, smoothing her jacket with a steady hand, and stepped to the stand. Her testimony was a blade, sharp, precise, cutting through the noise without flourish or embellishment. She recounted the confrontations, the manipulations. The moments when Ethan's power had loomed over them all like a shadow. Her voice never wavered, her words leaving no room for doubt, and when she sat down, she felt the room shift slightly. The tide turning in their favor. But it was Danielle who changed everything. When she took the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Her voice trembled at first. A fragile thread that threatened to break, but as she spoke, it grew stronger, fueled by a fire that had been smoldering for too long. She described the humiliation, the way Ethan's words had stripped her bare, left her questioning her worth. She spoke of the fear that had kept her awake at night. The anger that had simmered beneath her skin, threatening to consume her. But then she shifted, her tone softening as she told of the fight, the clawing, desperate struggle to reclaim her voice. Her power, her place in a world that had tried to erase her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away, they were proof of her survival. Badges of a war she'd won against herself as much as against him. Ethan's lawyer, a slick man with a practiced sneer, tried to unravel her story. He peppered her with questions. His tone dripping with condescension, searching for weaknesses to exploit. But Danielle met every jab with a response as steady as stone, her voice cutting through his bluster like a knife. By the time she stepped down, the air in the room had changed, charged with the weight of her truth, the unshakable force of her courage. Olivia caught her eye as she returned to the table. And the faintest smile passed between them, a quiet triumph amid the storm. Ethan sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. His eyes darted around the room. Wild and searching, but there was no escape. The evidence was a mountain, the testimonies a flood, and the truth a noose tightening around him. When the jury filed back in, their faces somber. The air crackled with anticipation. The foreman stood, his voice steady as he delivered the verdict, guilty. Ethan's hands gripped the table, his knuckles white. As if he could hold on to his crumbling world by sheer force of will. But it was gone, slipped away in the span of a single word. The judge's voice boomed through the room as he handed down the sentence, termination from the force, loss of pension, and a litany of criminal charges that carried the full weight of justice. Each word landed like a stone, burying Ethan deeper in the ruins of his own making. Danielle let out a slow, trembling breath, her shoulders shaking as the reality settled over her. Olivia reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, a silent promise that they had weathered the worst together. There was no fanfare, no outburst of joy, just a profound, heavy silence as Ethan was led away, his wrists bound in steel, his eyes hollowed out by defeat. Olivia watched him go, her face impassive but her heart steady. This wasn't about vengeance, though the thought had crossed her mind in darker moments. It was about accountability, about stripping away the shield of power he'd abused and laying bare the consequences of his choices. Justice wasn't a celebration, it was a reckoning, cold and unyielding, a mirror held up to those who thought themselves untouchable. In the days that followed, the station began to breathe again. The oppressive tension that had clung to the hallways like damp rot slowly dissipated, replaced by a cautious quiet. Officers nodded to Olivia as she passed, their greetings carrying a newfound respect rather than the guarded glances of before. Danielle returned to work, her chin lifted, her steps sure. She was a beacon now. A reminder that strength wasn't about never breaking but about piecing yourself back together, stronger than before. She took on new duties, her voice rising in meetings, advocating for those who'd been silenced as she once had. Olivia saw in her the makings of a leader, not the loud, brash kind, but the steady, unshakable sort who could weather any storm. Ethan's fall sent shockwaves through the precinct. Policies were dragged into the light, dissected, rewritten. Training sessions were revamped, the old ways questioned and discarded. The culture didn't transform overnight, change was slow, messy, imperfect, but it was moving. Olivia felt it in the air, a tentative hope that hadn't been there before. She knew the work wasn't finished, it never would be, not really. But for the first time in years, she believed they could keep pushing forward. One afternoon, Danielle appeared at Olivia's office door, leaning against the frame with a small, unguarded smile. "I never thought I'd walk these halls without feeling that weight," she said. Her voice soft but steady, like a river finding its course. Olivia set her pen down, leaning back in her chair, her eyes tracing the lines of Danielle's face, lines carved by pain, yes, but softened now by something lighter. "And now?" Olivia asked, her tone gentle. Danielle's smile grew, bright and unguarded. "Now I feel like I belong." Olivia nodded, a quiet pride swelling in her chest. "You always did," she said. "You just had to remind them." Danielle's eyes softened, a flicker of gratitude passing through them. "And myself," she added, almost to herself, before turning to leave. Olivia sat back, letting the silence wrap around her like a cloak. She thought of the sleepless nights, the gnawing doubt, the moments when fear had nearly won. She felt the burden lift, just a fraction, and it was enough. The fight wasn't over, justice was a marathon, not a sprint, but they'd taken the first step. Carved a path through the dark. Sometimes, she realized, that was all it took to keep going, one step, then another, fueled by the belief that the world could be better. This wasn't just Ethan's downfall or Danielle's triumph. It was a story of choices, of the silence that lets tyranny fester and the bravery it takes to shatter it. It was about the cost of power unchecked, the way it twists and consumes until nothing remains but wreckage. Ethan had built his kingdom on fear. But kingdoms like that never last, they crack under the weight of their own hubris. Danielle and Olivia had shown what happens when you refuse to bow. When you demand accountability not just from the tyrant but from everyone who stood by and watched. And in the end, it was a lesson etched in the scars they carried. Justice isn't a gift bestowed from above, it's a fire you stoke with your own hands, a flame that burns brightest when you dare to fight for it.